Okay, I think we can start at this moment. Just again, while some people are still connecting, we would like first to introduce ourselves and the topic that we would like to speak about today. First of all, let us thank you all for joining us today for this event, which we hope will be quite productive for everybody who is connected. So today is speaking Yulia Smurova, the Council of our Tax Practice. And myself, Maria Kabanova, I'm a senior associate of the tax practice of Seamless Legal. Just to present the agenda of our today webinar, the idea was for us today to share with you, first of all, some ideas and some highlights about how the transfer pricing compliance is going to look in 2023 and onwards, account taken of all of the specific conditions we are working in today. Even though the long-term plannings now sounds like a sort of a bad joke, we still would like to share with you some views. And what we believe could be even more helpful is that just a couple of days ago, our tax practice, together with one of the business associations we work closely with in Russia, organized joint event with some high-end representatives of the Federal Tax Service of Russia, specializing in the transfer pricing tax audits, which allows us today to share with you some views that they gave to us regarding the strengths and concerns that the taxpayers are having now. But last but not least, we decided today to combine in this event, which is mainly contributed to the transfer pricing compliance topics. Still, we decided to add here a bonus section and to give you some sort of a helicopter view of the limitations and currency controls implications that Russian taxpayers are now faced with when they're trying to administer the cross-border payments. And Yulia has kindly agreed to join me today for this event to share with you some experience and some issues in this domain. And we would also like to state that Yulia and myself and some other colleagues of our tax practice will be visiting Paris on the week starting 13th of March. And there we will be developing this topic that Yulia will highlight today in more detail. So if you have any questions, either to me or to Yulia, please feel free to drop us a line if you would like to meet with us in Paris, and we will be more than happy to do so. The first topic I would like to cover in my presentation is some statistics from the Federal Tax Service regarding the conduction of the transfer pricing tax audits in Russia. So don't worry, I'm not aiming to go in every painful detail about the statistics, but the idea why I wanted to share it with you today is to show you the number of tax audits specifically conducted in the transfer pricing domain today. As you can see on the slide, until 1st of September 2022, there have been 68 tax audits so far. This data which we share on the slides comes from the official sources, and it is a little bit overdue. The representatives of the Federal Tax Service shared with us that now this number comes to 70. But still, as you could imagine, this is quite a low number of 70 audits within 9 years while this control exists, which demonstrates the approach that the tax authorities also usually aim to pronounce, that within the transfer pricing tax audits, they do not have any specific plans or budgets that they are willing to fulfill, like the case frequently is for the ordinary tax audits in Russia. And they rather tend to focus on the risk profiles and to implement the risk-oriented approach, which means that if we speak about the levels of a tax control in Russia, when we talk about the transfer pricing domains, the first level would be the automatic selection. So based on the information provided by the taxpayers, which is primarily done in form of the transfer pricing notifications filed on a yearly basis, the tax authorities find some automatic triggers which attract their attention and may lead them to the idea that they should look into these transactions more precisely. It is important to say here that the tax authorities never explicitly share the risk profiles for a tax audit in the fear that the taxpayers will be finding some creative ways around these risk profiles, which is fair enough. But they mention that one single factor can never be used as a sole ground to initiate tax control, especially in the transfer pricing domain. This is always a combination of factors, and which is particularly important now because one of the questions that we had to the tax authorities is whether the exceptional losses derived by some companies in Russia last year may be used as a trigger for a control. And again, they confirmed that yes, this could draw additional attention, but there should not be a sole trigger. So if you end up being in the green, you are good. If you fall in the yellow, you are still in some kind of limbo. We have this special way of control that, frankly, the tax authorities are now very proud about, this so-called pre-audit analysis, meaning that the tax authorities do not aim to immediately open a tax audit as the ordinary one, or especially the transfer pricing one, but instead, within an open dialogue with the taxpayers, they try to get all the information they need to clarify some points that raise their attention. And if they're happy with this information, they do not go further. If not, they may initiate some more formalized procedure. So on the one hand, it is quite a useful tool for the tax authorities and the taxpayers to open a dialogue. Unfortunately, how we see it in practice, it does not always work this way, and sometimes it turns into some very lengthy and unformalized procedure when the tax authorities request various kinds of specific requests or without any specific time terms, and frequently the taxpayers need to find the proper balance between what they give and what they keep for themselves. So, well, the third level is the tax audit, which may be either the field tax audit that cannot formally cover the transfer pricing issues, which does not, however, entirely mean that they will not be looking into the prices, especially for cross-border intergroup flows. And I will talk about this issue a bit later when covering the topic of the intergroup services. Or they can go into the transfer pricing tax audit, which, as I mentioned, are still quite rare in Russia, but we still see some extension, at least of the perimeter of the tax audit. So these are no longer with the commodities. They tend to look into the cross-border transaction, into the transactions concerning goods or other goods and services, and so on. So just to remind you a little bit what changes in the transfer pricing tax legislation happened last year, the majority of them have been adopted in the so-called anti-crisis package, which was formalized by the law adopted in the end of last March. And indeed, the changes in the transfer pricing domain were mainly aimed at relaxing the rules for the taxpayers. So first of all, the threshold for the TP control for the cross-border transaction was doubled from 60 to 120 million rubles. And well, honestly, when this law was implemented, I thought that this measure might as well absorb itself, because at that time we had huge fluctuations of the currency rate in Russia, and with the euro reaching 100 or 120 rubles, well, we thought that it would be the same for the taxpayers as the last year, but in the end of the year, when the rate stabilized a little bit, we thought that it could at least allow Russian taxpayers to avoid accumulating some minor flows, but still, as we see it in practice, the majority of the cross-border flows in the major groups exceeds this threshold. Also, there were some minor changes to the scope of the domestic transactions, which I will not be talking into detail. One more important change is that in the period of 22 and 23, 23, the penalties established by the Russian tax code, which would normally apply if the tax authorities reveal some that the prices charged in the transaction are not arm's length, and this penalty is quite high. It counts 40%, irrespective of whether the tax authorities manage to prove the guilt of a taxpayer. So these penalties will not apply in the period of 2022 to 2023. But I would really call you not to consider this measure as a sort of an absolution, because although the penalty doesn't apply, still there is a risk of a control, there is a risk of additional tax accruals, and in 2022, again, there are some particular triggers for these risks that I will talk about a little bit later. Other than that, for the cross-border flows, the safe harbors, the extended safe harbors, which applied in Russia during the pandemic, have been extended in time and will now apply until the end of 2023 at least. And also one more minor change is that the safe harbors now formally allow providing the cross-border loans in Russian rubles from Russia at 0% rate. But again, I will come back to this subject a little bit later, because the practice of this may be not that optimistic. Apart from the changes to the tax legislation, there have been some important clarifications from the Russian tax authorities in the transfer pricing domain. And I can say that, well, the tax authorities issue such kinds of clarifications quite rarely, which is why each such methodological clarification could be waited and go, to be honest. First of all, there have been two short but very important letters, which are presented first on this slide, where the tax authorities first in history pronounced that the loss-making transaction performed in the current conditions may still be considered to be arm's length, because there are some objective economic factors influencing the profitability of the taxpayers in Russia. On the one hand, these letters, as I said, are very progressive, and they may be used by certain taxpayers in practice. But the bad news here is that these letters have been issued for some very particular types of the taxpayers in Russia. First of all, the companies who are engaged in exportation from Russia, and also the companies who are manufacturing some goods in Russia and sell them on the Russian territory. So at least formally, these letters do not explicitly cover the cross-border flows, such as importation of goods, provision of services, payment of cross-border royalties, and so on. And I can tell you that I have personally been in contact with the tax authorities through various business associations on this matter, stating that, look, in current environment, not only these categories of taxpayers can be generating such exceptional losses, but the tax authorities tend to be very cautious here. So they are saying, yes, we understand that there are some factors that influence you all. But first of all, we need to look into detail how each particular taxpayer influenced by the current conditions and why. For example, they say that if the Russian company is the routine distributor and has been pronounced by the group as such for many years before 2022, then as a routine distributor, it should normally be compensated by the group if it starts generating losses, and it should anyway generate its routine margin. And also they were saying that if, for example, some groups are taking the decision to interrupt the business in Russia and to freeze it for some period of time, the Russian budget should not be taking the cost for such commercial decisions, and it is still for the group to compensate this cost. Still, they pronounce that they are open for a discussion with the tax authorities, with the taxpayers, and they may consider issuing some more detailed explanations in case they have a specific request from certain group of taxpayers, but they want to know the particular cases and details, how the profitability of the Russian companies, of the Russian subsidiaries being influenced in Russia now. So if you have some cases to share, and if you're ready to initiate this kind of a discussion with the tax authorities, please feel free to contact me after the event. We may try to find some ways together how we present this case in Russia. Other from these quite revolutionary explanations, there have been some a little bit more technical but still important letters. First of all, there was a very peculiar letter issued by the Russian Ministry of Finance in September, where the tax authorities commented, first of all, they said that they reminded that the Russian tax code provides for some hierarchy of the sources of information that can be used when making the benchmarking analysis in Russia. And if the benchmarking is made in respect to a Russian company, first the search should be made among the Russian accounting statements, and only if they're unavailable or insufficient, the taxpayer may switch to other sources of information, such as, for example, global data, which in practice somehow limits the use of the pan-European and global benchmarks when proving the profitability of the Russian taxpayer. Those companies who are working with us as clients know that we have been pronouncing this risk in previous periods as well, but now we have a sort of an official clarification from the tax authorities on the matter. They also remind us that Russian transfer pricing legislation does not provide for calculation of the median when the arm's length range is calculated, which is why, again, we should rely on the rules and specific mechanism of calculation of the arm's length profitability range provided in the Russian law and not create some alternative mechanism. And finally, they also remind us that there is an hierarchy of the TP methodologies, and the taxpayers cannot immediately jump to the fourth method. They first need to prove why the first ones are not applicable in their case. It's interesting that when I was speaking about this letter in presence of the tax authorities on one of the latest events, they said that, well, we were not intending actually to make this letter public, and it was actually published in respect to a specific taxpayer within a mutual agreement procedure with Korea. But still, since we have now this explanation at hand, I decided to comment on this. Also, there have been some letters for more specific transactions performed with the commodities, which allows the taxpayers to use some alternative ways of proving the arm's length profitability of the flows other than the TP methodologies when they were inapplicable. And I decided to put on this slide one letter which is coming back from 2021, but maybe particularly important now, which commented on the such terms as the safe harbors and tax rulings, which are not clearly regulated in Russia. So first, this letter states that the only example of the safe harbors that we have in Russia is the ranges of interest rates for the intra-group loans that the taxpayers may use instead of making a lengthy study using the TP methodologies. And also they mentioned that the tax rulings issued by the foreign tax authorities cannot be used as a regulated price in Russia, which is why even if you receive this kind of a tax ruling in Russia, you would still need to prove that the prices applied are arm's length. So jumping into the current issues and ad hoc topics that we face now in Russia in 2022 and 2023. So the first of all, of course, it is profitability and adjustments. I will have a separate slide dedicated to this matter, but again, it all comes from the extraordinary losses that many Russian subsidiaries of international businesses are now facing. Other than from such extraordinary losses, we now see a restructuring of contractual relations and sometimes changes of the pricing terms. First of all, because there is a breach of customer logistic chains, which is why sometimes the agreements need to be rearranged and re-signed with some other jurisdictions than the ones used previously. And all this, of course, creates additional cost pressure on both sides. Another important topic that I will also be separately speaking about is the suspension of automatic exchange of CBCR reporting with some jurisdictions in Russia, and more generally, some limited access to foreign databases and difficulties in proving and finding sufficient data to ensure comparability that Russian taxpayers are now facing, because a lot of foreign providers of such information or software limited the access of the Russian companies to such information. Another interesting question is the parallel import, because with this kind of flows being developed in Russia and in situation when the customary sources of information, both for the taxpayers and the tax authorities, may be limited now, there is a fear that the tax authorities may be trying to use the prices charged in this parallel import as a sort of a benchmark, which is of course not acceptable for many taxpayers. And one more topic that I would like to highlight and come back to it later is the applicability of TP rules within and after the M&A transactions that we are now facing on the Russian market. So when we speak about the issues with the profitability and also with the financial results of the Russian taxpayers, I would like to state that before jumping into the voluntary adjustment of the tax base in the Russian Federation, which I notoriously put as the last point on this slide, maybe the taxpayers should be thinking about some other ways how they can present their case to the tax authorities and explain why in 2022 they fell into losses or they face some severe reduction of their profitability, which is not necessarily explicitly linked to the deviation from the arm's length character of the prices charged. Some of the solutions I specifically marked with a question mark in brackets, because I didn't want to give some harmful advice for you, but still I hear this kind of suggestions on various events and occasions that I attend, and I wanted to comment on them as well. So sometimes I hear from some companies that what's the problem if the Russian company starts to be loss-making and it used to be a routine distributor, maybe you can think about changing the TP methodology, or you can change the functional profile of the parties and prove that the prices are still arm's length. So here I can state that, well, also in 2022, there may indeed be some exceptional cases when the functional profile of the parties changes and the Russian company undertakes some extraordinary risk or functions which were previously performed by other entities of the group. Still, the tax authorities will be looking into these examples very cautiously because it would be hard for them to believe at once that the company changed its profile within 1 year unless it is somehow properly documented, it is evident from the formalizing agreements and so on and so forth. Some less aggressive ways of presenting your case to the tax authorities would be probably to apply some adjustments when you calculate the values within the arm's length range and making references to some actual economic reasons which influence your activities, such as, for example, additional expenses associated with the logistics and the reasons why you cannot transfer this cost on the final customer. For example, if you are bound by some long-term agreements which do not allow changes in prices at once, or you are just limited with the ability of the Russian purchasers who are not ready to buy these goods for a higher price. But the issue that I see here is that Russian transfer pricing law is actually very vague about what kind of adjustments the taxpayers can really make when they calculate their values and they make their benchmarks. And we raised this issue again when we had this discussion with the Federal Tax Service lately. And they have a position that there's certain vagueness of the Russian tax code gives the flexibility for the taxpayers, because the unified approach may not work well to all of the taxpayers in Russia, and this can open again a dialogue with the tax authorities. But here, in my view, it is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand they are right, but on the other, the taxpayers have to create their own ways to somehow amend their financial results without knowing whether this approach and this way will ever be accepted by the tax authorities. Well, but as I mentioned before, speaking on some previous slides, still the position of the tax authorities may be quite conservative, and they may still say that the routine distributors function in Russia should be compensated for their losses by the group, and not at the expense of the Russian budget, which is why the voluntary adjustment of the tax base in Russia still tends to be the most acceptable ways in the eyes of the Russian tax authorities. But here I need to mention that Russian transfer pricing legislation does not anyhow regulate the commercial relations between the parties, but only the ways the tax base should be determined in Russia, which is why we have no explicit guidance on how the parties should formalize their relations in case when the Russian taxpayer making an adjustment in front of the Russian budget wants to get some consideration from the group, which may also be in favor of the group, because they can at least deduct these expenses on their level, since otherwise, group-wise, there could be double taxation. And we tried to ask the representatives of the tax service how they see these ways the taxpayers use in practice to formalize its bilateral TP adjustments, such as credit notes, or such as the introduction of some new flows, like services flows or payment of bonuses. And they said that from their transfer pricing standpoint, they have no particular preferences as long as it benefits to the Russian budget, and they do not foresee how they will be aiming to challenge any such transfer pricing adjustment made, however it is formalized. But here I would like to remind you that apart from the transfer pricing tax audit, which is a separate kind of audits in Russia, as I already mentioned before, this kind of adjustments may be looked into by the tax authorities within the ordinary tax audit, or even by the customs authorities, which might create some issues in Russia, and we have these examples with some of our clients. For example, when the adjustment is made via the credit note, as the customs authority sees this credit note, they can think that the prices for the goods when they are imported to Russia are not finally determined, and they tend to send letters to the taxpayers asking why the adjustment was made, and maybe it can be changed again. So this can even create some logistic issues, because the customs authorities block the goods at the customs until they get the clarifications. And unfortunately, there is no proper dialogue between the transfer pricing group of the Federal Tax Service and the customs authorities, who may be asking controversial questions and aiming to meet controversial needs. Also, the credit notes may be questioned by the Russian banks. Also, we saw this in practice. They were trying to understand the nature of this document and the reasons why this payment is made, and why in this amount and not a different one. So you should be aware of that. Another solution that we see in practice is that the groups sometimes tend to introduce some separate flow from the services, from the goods one, and acquire some services from the Russian taxpayers and compensate them through the services remuneration. But here we can see some other issues. For example, the tax authorities may look into this kind of flows from the VAT perspective and try to question the nature of the flow. Also, we see that some taxpayers who, for example, apply the tax incentives in Russia, either regional tax incentives or incentives as IT companies, may have issues when determining the composition of their income, because they need to generate their income from some qualified activity, and when they get this kind of adjustments through a services flow, they need to account it in their revenue, and they may even be at a risk at losing the incentives if they continue this way. Also, we saw some examples when adjustments were formalized through payment of a bonus, but in my view, this is quite a tricky kind of a formalization, because again, the Russian authorities on various levels may be questioning the grounds for this bonus, how it should be booked by the Russian taxpayer, and also on the side of the foreign company who provides a bonus, there could be some deductibility issues, which, however, are not in the perimeter of the Russian tax law. Another topic that I already highlighted and I wanted to speak in a little bit more of detail is applicability of the transfer pricing rules, either in the M&A transactions that we now see in Russia, or after this kind of a transaction is executed. For example, one of the frequent ways to formalize transfer of the Russian assets that we see now is the MBO transaction, where the local management takes over the company previously held by the international group, and quite frequently this transaction is performed at some nominal value like €1, $1 whatsoever. So we specifically asked this question to the representatives of the Federal Tax Service, whether they see any transfer pricing issue when such kind of transaction is performed. And well, their reply was quite practical, that as long as there is no cash flow out of Russia, and as long as Russian taxpayers, such as local management, do not bear any extraordinary losses, they do not see particular transfer pricing issue when the management acquires these kinds of assets. Also, in the Russian tax laws, there have been some changes in terms of the last year, which allowed to exempt from taxation any material benefit derived by such local management as individuals. However, the tax authorities confirmed our concern and our suspicion that the situation may be not that optimistic if and when the international groups would try to implement the buyback scenario at the same price several years later. It is not a secret that many of these transactions are now performed with some option, and if this option is crystallized again as a nominal value, the tax authorities are saying that, well, we cannot plan this far, just like you cannot do it, but we may foresee that, for example, the local management can really invest in the development of the business during the period when they hold the ownership, which is why it will not be fair if they do not get additional compensation for their efforts. Also, they said that if, for example, the taxpayer performs some independent appraisal, and they have the appraisal report proving or somehow assessing the value of the assets transferred, this could be used by the Russian authorities as a benchmark, which is not a particular good news in my view, because many companies now are forced to get this kind of an appraisal when they apply to the governmental commission in Russia to get a clearance for this transaction. And the results of this appraisal may be usually much higher than this $1 or €1. Again, it's not an issue when the shares are acquired by the Russian individuals, but it will likely be an issue when the buyback scenario is crystallized. Another issue to consider is whether the transfer pricing rules may still continue to apply even if the corporate ties are broken, because we expect, and the tax authorities confirmed this approach, that if, for example, there is no longer direct corporate hierarchy between the Russian company, who is now held by the local management, and the international group, but still some control remains, either through these buyback options which exist, or through some other means. The tax authorities will likely apply a more extended approach and consider these companies to be interrelated, even if they do not meet the formal criteria for the related persons. And in this case, these remaining transactions with the former group may still fall under the transfer pricing control. Which is why if you still conserve this kind of flows and you will be deducting the corresponding costs in future, we highly suggest looking into such flows in a view of a potential applicability of the transfer pricing rules in Russia. Another subject which I wanted to speak about is the issues with exchange of the information, either on the level of the separate jurisdiction or even on the level of particular taxpayers and the international groups, which makes the life of the Russian taxpayers who need to meet the transfer pricing requirements more complicated. First of all, I would like to say that we need to distinguish between different types of termination or suspension of the information exchange or help in the tax domains, because many countries last year announced their intention to suspend any kind of exchange with Russia. However, well, as the Russian tax authorities shared at least, this was not really the case for all kinds of such exchange. For example, despite the fact that Germany and Austria explicitly confirmed that they are willing to suspend the exchange of information, for the time being, they are considered by the Russian tax authorities as continuing to exchange the CBCR data. And the fact that proves this is that in the very end of December last year, Russian tax authorities published a reviewed list of the jurisdictions who do not exchange CBCRs with Russia, and Germany and Austria are not within this blacklist. However, Switzerland was added in the list of the jurisdictions who do not exchange this kind of information, and Great Britain and the USA have already been in this list. What this practically means for you is that if, for example, you make part of the international group who are bound to file CBCR reporting globally, Russian tax authorities may request the CBCR reporting from you, while under the normal course of actions, if the CBCR is filed in some other jurisdictions like France, Germany, whatever, Russian tax authorities should be requesting it from the foreign tax authorities and not from the Russian taxpayers. Another issue to consider here is that not only the CBCR reporting may be at risk. For example, if the Russian taxpayer leaves the international group in 2022, in 2023, it may still be bound to report its previous years, 2022, 2021, and so on. And if all of the connections with the previous group are broken, they may really have issues with getting sufficient data to ensure transfer pricing compliance in Russia. And again, we presented this issue to the Russian tax authorities, saying that, look, even the good faith taxpayers may be having this kind of problems, but they said, well, we understand that, but on the other hand, we cannot stop the transfer pricing control on this ground alone, and we are actually on the same situation. We have to use the information from some open sources. We are also limited in our ways to get this data, which is why we should probably find some joint way over this problem. For example, rely on some information from the open sources, such as published financial statements of the foreign companies, which you may find on some official websites, or maybe you can use some Russian data with making certain adjustments. But they also want us that if you somehow manage to get some information from abroad, for example, from some foreign database, you should still be in a position to somehow verify it to the tax authorities and not just state that you took this figure somewhere out of the blue. So this is again something you should be thinking about in process or even before you start the M&A transaction aimed at leaving the international group. So these are the agreements that should be reached between you and the group on how you are going to deal with this issue if you are faced with this kind of request already after you leave the group. And maybe a last set of topics that I would like to highlight today, knowing that the time is limited, is the update we received from the tax authorities regarding other issues when administering and managing the intergroup flows that are not necessarily linked to the transfer pricing itself. For example, one of the potential risk areas could be the increased attention of the Russian tax authorities to any changes of the scope of the intergroup flows taking place in 2022. Which is quite evident because if you introduce some new flows, the tax authorities will be thinking that maybe you are trying to find some alternative ways to get money back from Russia. If you cease providing some services to Russian subsidiaries, this may put at risk the justification of the relevant costs for the previous periods, because the tax authorities may be saying that, well, look, you continue to live happily without the services, so why did you bear this cost before? However, the tax authorities again pronounce their intention to take into consideration the real economic grounds behind this. Well, in practice, this could still create an issue, especially when you deal with your regional tax inspector who may not be aware of all of the latest trends and positions. Another issue to consider is that the control may happen even if you voluntarily decide not to deduct the corresponding costs for the taxation purposes, because the tax authorities may still look at this flow from the withholding taxation standpoint. So they are saying that, well, if you do not deduct this cost because the services are not properly documented or economically justified, maybe you are hiding some other kind of flow, such as dividends or other income, and we need to dig deeper into the nature and qualification of this flow at all. Still, they take the position that the cost of the services should be linked to the volume of the services and the number of the supporting documents, which practically means that the more expensive your service are, the more documents you need to justify it. Also, there is a switch from the previously used timesheets to some alternative pricing methodologies, and the tax authorities are aiming to accept, for example, some allocation keys in Russia. They still confirm that the flat allocation key determined on the revenue alone doesn't work. They do not believe it, and this really creates an issue for the tax payers, because on the one hand, they need to prove that their pricing methodology in Russia is consistent with the one used by the group, but this is really a complicated task when for example, the whole group use the flat allocation key links to revenue, and it works well, but for the Russian taxpayer, you need to invent something else. Also, we see that now tax authorities look into detail, not only into intergroup services, but also into the license arrangement. For example, how the price for the licenses is being formed. If it is linked to some kind of a revenue, what revenue forms the base for calculation of the royalties. So this should be also your area of the attention. Intergroup financing may also present some potential tax issues if, for example, the taxpayers are now in a situation where they have to prolong the loan transactions that they previously had with the foreign groups because they cannot, they just physically cannot return the funds back. But if they continue to bear the interest costs, this may draw attention of the Russian tax authorities. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, although formally our tax legislation now allows providing the ruble loans from Russia at 0%, the tax authorities explicitly say that they're still not very happy with these examples, because they can have an idea that you are trying to hide some other kind of the flow, or that you are trying to shift profitability back from Russia. Actually, my time already being due. I will not be stopping on other kinds of questions that may happen here, because honestly, this topic is endless. But in the end of the presentation, I will be happy to address any questions you may have, and that you can send to the chat, or again, you can drop me a line. My contacts will be at the end of the presentation, and I will be happy to answer. And at this stage, I will transfer the word to my colleague Julia to speak on her part of the topic.
Maria, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining our webinar today. As Masha said, we decided to extend a little bit our presentation, and I'm pleased to share with you our bonus section, which will be dedicated to the currency control and counter-sanction measures. It's not a secret that this is really a very hot topic now since last year, and continue to be a very hot topic, and it especially a hot topic in terms of administration of intragroup flows. Talking about the complexity of administration of intragroup transactions in terms of currency control. Before last year, you all know that currency control matters was such kind of standard common matters, well administrated by the Russian banks, by the managers of the company. There were no some extremely special in this area. Currency law tended to be less aggressive, less restrictive, and the government and the state it interferes into the flows and to the transaction in a very specific cases. Now the things changed, and now the currency control really became a very strict and good tool to control the cross-border transaction. And to restrict, and the measure to restrict or limit the cash flows, cross-border cash flows. So really, this currency control counter-sanction measure, it's very huge, complex, very difficult for analysis topic. And of course, during the presentation, I can't obviously give you some crystally understandable, pure, accurate navigating tool in order you could see where you can see all the important measures, all the important things. But I will try today to highlight the most important ones in order for you to have a basic navigating tool, and when you have your cross-border transaction, you will also know from what you should start. So when we are talking about currency control and counter-sanction measures, first we should see on our transaction what is the nature of the transaction and what is the currency of the transaction. The second question to ask for ourselves is to define what is the country of state of your counterparty. After we answer these questions, we go further, and we should go into details for currency control measures and for counter-sanction measures. I put here both because I would like to stress that currency control and counter-sanction measures, in terms of currency control, they existed at the same time. These are two different branches of legislation, and they exist in parallel. Sometimes they contradict to each other, but in any case, we should bear in mind both of them. Talking about navigation among all these measures, the complexity is not only due to the internal reasons in Russia, due to the existence of currency control, of counter-sanction measures, restrictions and limitations, but the complexity is also because the external factors, which is connected with the new requirements of the foreign banks, of the risk of blocking funds on the way, which I think we see and you see and know it very well, and new KYC politics and etc. What is the answer of the business? The answer of the business is always try to navigate, try to search possible ways to perform the transaction, to perform the payment. And since last year, we participated in a very huge number of transactions and the events of the clients where they try to restructure their contracts, they replace counterparties, they change the currency of the transactions. They communicated a lot of times with the Russian banks, trying to convince them that their transaction it's allowed under the Russian law. And sometimes we see situations when the groups has to even to change their corporate structure. It's very difficult, but it could be also the case if you want to continue your business transactions. Let's say a few words about counter-sanction measures. What are the matters of their concern? First, they put some restrictions on foreign currency circulation in Russia and money transfers. Second, these counter-sanction measures, they concerns some specific transactions, cross-border transactions. As a matter of example, these are loans, these are dividend distributions. And now we have in Russia several state authorities, Russian Central Bank, Russian Ministry of Finance, and a newly created governmental commission, which is authorized to issue approvals for certain transactions. And the list of these transactions, of course, it's put in the specific decrees of the Russian presidents. As a matter of example, I can put here that M&A transactions, the transfer of dividends, again, the provision and repayment of loans. Some transactions are also subject to temporary rules for their performance. So what is the basic questions to answer when we are talking about counter-sanction measures? First, we need to understand whether we are subject to these measures or not. In order to do it, the basic question is the country of your counterparty. I think you know that there is an exhaustive list of, let's say in brackets, of unfriendly states. And if your counterparty is from this state, it means that in any case you should double check whether the counter-sanction measure applies to your transaction or not. This list tends to be extending, and this list is valid as of 28th of October 2022. So now it looks like this. Very important to know that when you define the country of your counterparty, the state of your counterparty, you should not only consider the state of legal registration of your counterparty. You should go further and check who controls your counterparty and who is UBOs, because it's very important issue, because sometimes counter-sanction measures, they state the exceptions and they don't apply to the transactions which are performed with the companies which are legally registered in the unfriendly states, but at the same time being under the control of the persons from friendly states or even by Russian persons. Of course, even each specific counter-sanction measures has its own scale of such exceptions. It needs to be double-checked each time. On the next slide, I will give you a very, very brief overview of the transactions which are currently permitted and which are restricted or banned. Again, I would say that this is the list really valid as of today, because tomorrow we could have another reality, because counter-sanction measures, they are developing very quickly, and the new laws are decrees adopted very quickly, and so each time, if you plan some specific transaction that was allowed yesterday, but you plan it today, you need in any case to double check whether it's really allowed or not, regardless of the fact that you think that maybe you know it quite well. You will see on the right side some gray area for the transaction. It's interesting that you will see there some basic transaction which looks like basic account for the business, for example, some set-offs, set-off transactions. Why I put it like gray area? The reason is due to inconsistency between the currency control law and counter-sanction measures. Because, as I told earlier, they existed in parallel, and currency control law wasn't changed a lot since last year, and sometimes it really contradicts to the counter-sanction measures. So there are some transactions they could be allowed according to the currency control rules, but it seems that they are not so allowed due to the counter-sanction measures. Talking about currency control regulation, this is the only federal law number 173 FEZE, and again, due to the existence of counter-sanctions measures, who really look like a double restriction. We need to read this currency control law in a new way, in another way, and some of the articles of this law, it's not look like so optimistic now. On the slide, I will put the examples of Article 6, which say that currency operations between Russian currency residents and non-residents are performed without limitation. It's not like that now. It looks like this according to currency control law, but again, there are counter-sanction measures who could prohibit some operations. Article 12 is dedicated to the allowed operations, credit and debit operations through the foreign bank accounts of the Russian currency residents. So if you plan such kind of operations, you should first double check whether it's allowed according to Article 12, and afterwards to double check whether there is any additional counter-sanction measures or decrees which put additional limitations. And Article 18, which looks now quite controversial, because 2 years ago the repatriation requirements was abolished. But now this issue is again raised because there are some contradictional provisions between currency control law and the counter-sanction measures. I will not elaborate a lot about this topic now, because it's very long topic to discuss about. If it's relevant for you, I will feel free to communicate to you in person after the presentation in more details. I think all of you see that the question is really very, very complex, and the very reasonable question here. And okay, if we fail to puzzle out all these matters, all these currency control, counter-sanction measures, what happened? There are some answers you will see on the slide. Basically, the result is refusal to perform operation by the Russian banks, because Russian banks they are also under the pressure of the central bank. They have also the internal lawyers who analyze the counter-sanction measures, and they sometimes different banks has different view on practical implementation of these matters, and this should be considered also. Further to risk looks now quite theoretical, but I think that they could become the reality in the future. The first risk is the risk of for the transaction of being declared null and void if counter-sanction measures are violated. And further, the potential risk of liability for violation of counter-sanction measures. Fortunately, now my mind is that there is no violation. There are no specific norms for violation of counter-sanction measures, but we don't know what will happen tomorrow. And I think one day some specific norms or punishment could be adopted by law. And finally, I would say some words who really monitors, along with the business, along with the lawyers, who also monitors these counter-sanction measures and controls them and try to do something with that. First, this is of course Russian banks who are in charge of currency control matters, and Russian banks are the more think about these issues. Secondly, these are Russian tax authorities, because they are also in charge of currency control, and they control these measures, and they could put punishment for infringement of the currency control law. It could be also Russian notaries or register of shares who could reject to do something if they consider that Russian counter-sanction measures are not respected. So thank you very much for your patience, for your time. I think we had a very fruitful overview of the hottest tax and currency control topics. Feel free to share your questions in the chat, or we will be very happy to speak with you in person or by email after our webinar, me and Maria. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and please do not forget, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentations, that Yulia and I and our colleagues will be in Paris presenting on some similar topics, and we'll be happy to meet with any of you if the case be. So thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.